Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I thought I'd do something a little bit different today, just kind of change up what I'm doing, and I want to make a video about John Dos Passos. Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and I are rereading Dos Passos' USA trilogy, probably his most famous works. And I want to do a video about Dos Passos because he is, I think, a very important American writer from the 20s and 30s who is not completely forgotten, certainly, but is oftentimes overlooked by people looking to read books from that time period. So I just want to do a brief kind of biography of Dos Passos and some discussion of his work here. So Dos Passos was Harvard educated. He was widely traveled as an author. He was a part of the modernist movement. He was a member of the Lost Generation, one of the founding members, I guess, of the American expatriate community, which, moved to Paris and haunted the cafes there. He was a good friend of Ernest Hemingway for a while, of Gerald and Sarah Murphy, kind of the wealthy couple who befriended lots of the Lost Generation writers, including Hemingway and others. He spent some time at Gertrude Stein's salon, even though he really didn't care for that very much. He was very leftward-leaning writer, and politics plays a large role in almost all of his works. I think you can find some element, some edge of politics, and for a time, he would have been considered one of the American modernist master writers, along with Hemingway, Faulkner, and Fitzgerald. Dos Passos' name would have been there. He began his writing career with, not uncommon for somebody who began writing in the 1920s, he began his writing career with a book called One Man's Initiation, 1916, which was based on his own experiences as an ambulance driver in World War I. In 1921, he published a fairly controversial and groundbreaking book called Three Soldiers, which was explicitly anti-war in its message. A lot of people don't remember this or know this, but World War I created a big backlash in the United States, and there was a strong feeling that the war had been fought for economic reasons, and that kind of colored and influenced a lot of people's political views, particularly already leftward-leaning artistic types. Three Soldiers is anti-war, and so in the sense that it kind of broke ground that allowed other books that dealt with the war more realistically than Three Soldiers does, but it allowed other books by Americans to be published that also took a negative view towards the way the war had been fought and the reasons it had been fought and the dehumanizing aspects of that. He also published a book called Manhattan Transfer, which is essentially a book about life in New York City, Manhattan, literally, as during the 1920s, which he had some experience living there. As I said before, he traveled widely. And in this book, he employs the stream of consciousness technique, which was common and popular among modernist writers. His best work, probably, and his most important work, is known as the USA trilogy. That's comprised of 3 books published, I believe, between 1935 and 1936. The first being The 42nd Parallel, which Jack and I are reading this month, and then 1919, and then The Big Money. These books are they're kind of proletariat books without being overtly as political as the normal proletariat book of the time period. And there are some real innovations in this book, along with the narrative story. And there is a narrative in the books. Along with that narrative, there are sections in each of the book called The Camera Eye, in which there's a stream of consciousness point of view. Sometimes it's somebody famous, sometimes it isn't, where you're like in their head, and he kind of writes from that point of view. There are newsreel sections in which he introduces headlines and bits of news stories, real, fabricated, I'm not exactly sure. And that technique was really innovative, and it had a tremendous influence on other writers. As I said, his politics were definitely leftward-leaning. He identified with and sympathized with the worker and what he would refer to as the peasant class. The USA trilogy and some of his other works are very pro-international workers of the world, or the Wobblies. He was a part of organizations that were tied to the Soviet Union and communism. He visited Moscow for a while. He was a part of the Dewey Commission for the Defense of Trotsky, kind of an American defense of Trotsky, who was on trial, the show trials that took place in the Soviet Union. When the Spanish Civil War started, his sympathies were naturally with the loyalist side against fascists, and he, like Hemingway, traveled to Spain to report on the Spanish-American War and to be a part of what was going on there. He became really disenchanted quickly with what was happening there when he came to realize that the Soviet Union was exerting a tremendous amount of influence over the loyalist side. And in fact, this was one of the reasons for his break with Hemingway, who went along with that aspect of the Spanish Civil War, but particularly involving the assassination of a friend of Dos Passos named Jose Robles, who was a member of the Spanish upper class, but who had very leftward leanings, and in all likelihood was assassinated on Stalin's orders because he was resisting some of Stalin's communist efforts to control the Spanish Civil War. Later in his life and after World War II, he became increasingly conservative, so much so that I believe at the end of his life he actually endorsed Richard Nixon for president in 1968. His books after World War II are not as well known and are not as widely read, I don't think, but he wrote a book which gave him some success, I believe, in the 1940s called Chosen Country, and in the 1950s he wrote a nonfiction book called The Head and Heart of Thomas Jefferson, which also received some positive reviews. He was also an artist. I believe the original copies of the USA trilogy contain little sketch works from Dos Passos, and he tried to be an artist later in life, but was never particularly successful there. You might be wondering what happened to Dos Passos. Why did he fade from view and memory and from fame so quickly? Probably, I think his politics were probably the biggest reason. It's difficult to be a person who was a leftist and was associated with communist organizations and with the leftist labor union movement. It was difficult to be that person in the 1950s, and he wasn't. He was more conservative, but as a conservative, it was hard for him to promote his own work from the 1920s and 30s, which was not, and those works became out of fashion during the periods of the Red Scare and McCarthyism and the Cold War in the 1960s, and his work that he wrote when he was a conservative were not as successful, and so for that reason he faded from view. But also he was one of the victims of Hemingway's anger. I plan on making a video about this for one of my Bookish After Darks video about what happened to that friendship and why, and some of the more sordid aspects of that. But Hemingway really just was vicious to Dos Passos, and if you've read Hemingway's A Movable Feast, the pilot fish that Hemingway talks about at the end of that is Dos Passos, and he more or less blamed Dos Passos for introducing him to his second wife, for ruining his first marriage, for introducing him to rich people. I don't know if you know this or not, but Hemingway in A Movable Feast was kind of putting forth the idea that he was at his best when he was poor, and that wealth and comfort kind of made his writing more difficult and not as good. And he liked to present this idea that he was this innocent, pure artist who was then corrupted by people like Dos Passos. Well, Dos Passos never really spoke out against Hemingway because of their friendship, which he valued up until it ended. And as a result, I think Hemingway's view of Dos Passos is the one that was left. And so I think that's what happened. But he did have a lot of influence. I think I might have mentioned last Saturday that he influenced Jean-Paul Sartre's Road to Freedom trilogy. And Sartre considered Dos Passos to be one of the best writers of the 1930s. He influenced the book Berlin Alexanderplatz Owes a Debt in terms of influence to Dos Passos and his work. His newsreel style, that thing of interjecting actual news headlines and stuff like that, has been borrowed by a number of writers. The last one I can remember was George Saunders in Lincoln and the Bardo actually borrowed that kind of style or used that, which I'm sure he was aware. Dos Passos was a pioneer of. And I also think that, and I talked with Jack about this, I also think that Dos Passos influenced Jack Kerouac in the 42nd Parallel, the first of the USA Trilogy books. There's kind of a romanticization of life on the road and life as a hobo, and which, if you've read Kerouac's On the Road, Kerouac certainly romanticized that as well. Anyway, there you go. There's my little brief biographical sketch of John Dos Passos. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.